Wow, c'est vraiment dégoûtant. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name is Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all of the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the channel, I recommend you check out the introduction video. There's a link to it in the description below, and it's going to give you a good overview of the horror movie syllabus, what we're all about. In short, we look at a particular subgenre of horror, then we pick 3 movies from that subgenre to explore. But this is our Doctorate Edition series. This is where we revisit a subgenre that we've already covered here on the channel, and then we kind of do a recap of the video we did previously, and then we explore it a little bit further by coming up with a 4th doctorate level selection, something a little bit more off the beaten path, a little bit deeper cut, or a little less known, something that's a little bit more obscure maybe, or just something that really kind of further explores the subgenre as a whole. And that's what we're doing today with the new French Extremity subgenre. Now, some of you may have already seen our previous new French Extremity video. If you haven't, I'll leave a link to that in the description below. But we went over this subgenre that is pretty notorious and well known for being very extreme and gory and gross and violent, all of which is true. But we went into the history of the new French Extremity just a little bit of the background of the movement, if you will, coming out of France for the most part, and what it meant, and how while there is a lot of this gore and extremeness and violence, the real key to the new French Extremity is being transgressive, doing stuff and showing stuff and tackling subject matter and things, incidents, whatever, that is transgressive, in a transgressive manner, trying to cross boundaries and push envelopes. And it usually is being done with a kind of a message, a social or political commentary or idea, something more than just for the sake of being splatter, being fun, gory stuff. For the most part, this tends to be true, although not universally true. We talked about that a little bit in the video, but it's interesting too because it comes from a French perspective. So an American like me may not even always understand what the social or political message is supposed to be of the movie, but the transgressiveness of it almost always shines through very strongly. These movies tend to be pretty polarizing. There's a lot of people that it ain't for. It's just too gross, too extreme, too violent. So be it. And then there's some of us gorehounds who love these movies. I'm one of those, of course. And these movies are for you. And there's a lot of you out there because the previous video was very popular for the channel. Thank you guys for watching, by the way. And so I know there's a lot of you out there who love this stuff, waiting to explore it a little more. Now, here's the thing. Movies that are considered new French Extremity, that the list is kind of weird because there's a small version of the list. People say like this is what the new French Extremity is. These are the movies that qualify. And then there's like a broader list that people will call like even movies that aren't French and say it's part of the new French Extremity, which is kind of weird. They just call it the new Extremity at that point. And so it's a little nebulous what qualifies, what doesn't qualify. And that's going to matter in our conversation later today. But for now, let's go ahead and dig into the movies we did discuss that are very clearly some of the best examples of the new French Extremity. The first movie that we looked at on the original video was Frontiers. And Frontiers has a really strong reputation for being a very violent movie. The reputation is that it's an extremely violent movie. And it's a reputation that it, for the most part, pretty much lives up to. The movie is admittedly not my favorite new French Extremity film, but I do like it. I do think it's very good. And I talked about that in the video, how it's just though it's not as good as some of the other ones. It's the only issue I have with it is there are other movies out there that are even better. But it is a really good movie. And this is a movie that wears its themes and its politics kind of on its sleeve. It's really front and center on what it's trying to say in terms thematically about social and political change in France specifically, but those themes are kind of universal. They're things that apply even today, years later, and even in America. They're things that people can relate to and understand. They're pretty universal. Themes of bigotry and hatred and stuff like that. Pretty easy to follow. So interesting movie, and also interesting that it was part of the After Dark Horror Fest, which I talked about in the video as, a couple movies from that we were going to be looking at. Turns out we're going to be looking at a lot of movies from the After Dark Horror Fest, but that's a topic for another conversation, another time. For now, Frontiers was one that was definitely new French Extremity and definitely one to check out. Now, the next movie we talked about was High Tension. And when we talked about high tension, we talked about how it had a couple different other names, hot tension, switchblade sisters. So there's a couple different names depending on what region you were in when you were seeing it. But what we really focused on was how polarizing of a movie it is, how some people really enjoy it and some people really don't like it. And it's because of the twist in the movie. The twist in the movie, which, we didn't want to spoil, but it is a significant thing to talk about. The twist in the movie alienates people. Some people can roll with it, some people can't. And even I had to admit, and I like the movie very much. I roll with the twist just fine. But even I had to admit, the movie cheats. It cheats a lot in trying to get you to believe into the twist. And that can usually be a deal breaker for a lot of people, including myself. But it didn't bother me in this movie because I enjoyed the gore, the kills. They were fun. Like this movie, unlike, say, Frontiers, which is a little bit more rougher edge, the kills here feel like they're a little bit more fun. They feel like a little bit more of a slasher vibe. Like it's intending you to enjoy the brutality and the gore effects and things like that a little bit more. So this is a movie that I felt was like a little bit more of a fun ride. So because of that, I could roll with this twist stuff and the kind of the cheating that's going on there. I enjoyed the leads, I enjoyed the action and the gore, so it was enough for me to be pleased when there. But not everybody agrees with me, so this is one that's a little bit more controversial, but it is definitely new French Extremity. And the last movie that we looked at was, of course, Martyrs. And Martyrs is one of my favorites. It's definitely my favorite new French Extremity movie and one of my favorite horror movies, really. I talked about that in the video. And I talked about how I enjoy how unexpected the movie is, how the plot goes places that you're not expecting to go. Kind of plot twist, but not even so much plot twist. It's just like this movie's plot goes in very interesting directions that you're not expecting it to do in a way that's really great. But the movie also, while it has some incredibly horrific things in it, it's not just the gore, but also the actual acts and activities that are going on there, the violence and the depravity that's in there is really off-putting, even affecting someone like me who watches this stuff all the time. It seems like it has something more to say about that. The movie feels more philosophical. It does have a message. It has commentary on faith and religion and torture and violence. And it's obviously a movie that's not for everyone. Not everybody's going to be able to roll with this movie, and that's fine. But I really like that it has something to say, and it's not just an uncomfortable, gory watch, but it is something that feels more meaningful, at least to me. And I think a lot of other people agree on that. Now, the remake, not so much. We talked about the remake too. That movie, you can avoid that one. But the original Martyrs, if you really want to know New French Extremity, this one's the must see. But it's not for everybody. So those are the movies that we looked at on our previous video, and now let's get into our new doctorate level selection. Our doctorate level selection for the new French Extremity is In My Skin. In My Skin came out in 2002 and was written and directed by the star of the movie, Marina Devon, in her directing debut. So she wrote this movie, she directed it, and she starred in it. This is really her show from start to finish. And it's an impressive debut, to say the least. And it's also a really impressive performance, but we're going to get into all that in just a second. First, if you haven't seen it before, the movie is about a woman who, at a work party, work function, winds up injuring her leg, getting a cut on her leg, doesn't even realize it at first, and it's pretty bad. Goes to the doctor, gets it sutured up, and it's a pretty bad scar, and it's healing, and it's a pretty bad cut. But then she starts to get really fascinated with it, and with the fascination of doing another cut and starting to devolve into this obsession with self-harm in a way that is affecting her work, it's affecting her relationships, it's affecting her mental health, or her mental health is affecting it, however you want to look at it. But not, suffice to say, not a great situation to be in, and we're going to stop there so as to not spoil the movie any further. But the movie is tackling some really heavy stuff, but it is a less notorious New French Extremity film. It's generally considered New French Extremity. If you look at lists of New French Extremity movies, it tends to be on there. People tend to describe it that way. But it is arguably not as graphic as what you think of when you think of the New French Extremity. When you think of movies like Martyrs or Inside or Frontiers or even Irreversible, like these movies really have a sort of graphicness to us that this movie doesn't quite achieve. Now, that said, it's still not for the squeamish. Like, there's a self-harm trigger warning for this movie for sure. And it's still not, like, while it's not getting overly graphic, it's not just really coating the screen with blood, it's still showing stuff, and it's also implying stuff enough to make it feel uncomfortable and disturbing. The movie really is kind of a body horror movie, while also being kind of a psychological horror movie that is tackling mental health issues and concerns. In particular, it's exploring self-harm and self-mutilation and where that comes from and how it affects people and like the motivation or lack thereof for it, the compulsion, I guess, of it in a fascinating way, in a very serious way. The movie is not exactly trying to be fun, it's taking the subject matter seriously in a way that I think is only not only important but effective. I think the movie winds up having more of an impact because it's treating its subject matter very seriously, understanding that this is, something that really happens to people, that the psychological condition happens, and it is sad, and it is disturbing, and it is dangerous. And that's where this movie's going with it. Now, does it have some moments of levity? Yes. Does it have some interesting stuff, like the psychological perspective that she has? Yes. There's a whole scene where her hand comes off at a dinner table, and it's in her head, but it's also kind of shown. It's interesting to see this perspective, and what does it really mean? It's a little unclear because your director Marina Devan is not spoon feeding this to you. She's leading the movie both as the director and as the star, and she's remaining inscrutable in both roles. As a director, she and the writer, she's not spelling everything out for you. She's letting you witness what this looks like, this compulsion, without having some authority figure come in and tell you this is what it is or this is what it means. And as a performance, she's holding back. She's not fully emoting as a character to kind of give you this trauma that she's going through or this dramatic, demonstrative aspect of the performance. It's kind of restrained. It is kind of almost aloof and disconnected and detached in a way that works. It further underscores what's being said in the movie about how the person's perspective is when they're suffering from something like this, and how detached they feel from everything and everyone, and how what they're doing to their own body is their way of connecting. And I think that is a message that was trying to be told in the film. And after the fact, looking at like reviews and stuff like that and researching for the video, a lot of critics picked up on this idea of this being a movie about body autonomy. And it seems kind of ridiculous because it's like somebody doing self-harm, but if you dig into it, it does make sense a little bit, because throughout the movie you've got other people kind of trying to control what this woman does, whether it's the guys at work trying to throw her in the pool, or her boyfriend who's very upset about like what's going on with her and how she might be hurting herself, but he comes off as very controlling, and every time he's worried about it, it's kind of framed as like he wants to make it about him and like, what have I done to make you do this? Or her best friend who's trying to be helpful and be there for her, but really kind of comes off as like a smothering nuisance. It's really interesting to see all the people who are trying to do something good or right being portrayed in a way that's kind of negative, because that's the perspective of the protagonist, and how everybody's kind of trying to tell her what to do and control her. And so she's eschewing all of that and doing her own thing and cutting herself because that's what she wants to do. It's fascinating. It's a really interesting way to tackle the subject matter, in a really uncomfortable way too, because it's almost like the movie wants you to root for her to do this, but you clearly don't want to root for her to do this. And when she's doing it, it is uncomfortable. It doesn't, like I said, it doesn't revel in the gore and the blood. It doesn't do it to be showy and show off special effects over there. It does it to make you feel uncomfortable, and it's effective. It's, again, not as graphic as other movies, but it kind of doesn't need to be, because your mind is filling the blanks. And again, knowing this real condition that people have, this real compulsion that people act out, it makes it a uncomfortable watch. This is a movie, again, it's not going to be for everybody. For some people, this is going to be an issue, and that's okay. Maybe skip it. But it's a very powerful movie. And again, directing debut by Marina Devan, and a really confident performance. Like, this movie is it's there's a lot of copious nudity. She's naked a lot, but in a very unglamorous way, to show off the body harm. And again, the gore is very simple. It's just blood and stuff like that. It's not really like gaping wounds and stuff like that. But the unglamorous portrayal of this character, naked in a way that's not really sexualized, and worn down and injured, and looking haggard. It's a really interesting for her to put herself out there and put herself through that performance as the director and writer, to put herself in those shoes and deliver that performance, very effective. It's a challenging role, and she crushes it, frankly. You care about this woman, even though she's so detached, and she's a tragic figure, and you feel for it. That's, I think, the real reason why this movie works so well, is you feel the injuries. They may not be as gruesome looking as, say, Martyrs, but man, do you feel it. You feel for her. You are sympathetic to her. You want her to get better, but you also kind of just see how it's not gonna get better. And it's a bleak movie, I'm not gonna lie. It has an ambiguous ending, which again, I think works for it really well. Doesn't spell everything out for you. I'm a little unclear what the ending means. I have my own interpretations. I'm not going to talk about it here because I don't want to spoil it, but I have my own interpretations, and I'm sure other people do too. We can talk about it in the comments, but I really like that this movie just kind of presented it the way it did. It showed the uncomfortable reality of it, the perspective of the protagonist, and what's going through her mind and how she's seeing the world, and the logic behind it, or the illogic of it, but from her perspective, the logic of it, and how everybody else feels like antagonistic to her. That's a cool, interesting, fresh way to do this. It doesn't feel trite. It doesn't feel pandering. It feels authentic. It feels honest. And I think that's why people really look at this and see New French Extremity, because it is making some sort of statement, a political, social statement, and also is very transgressive. Like I said, it's taking a perspective that is a dark perspective, that is an uncomfortable perspective and an unpopular perspective, and really kind of running with that. So yeah, it's an interesting New French Extremity. While it may not scratch your gore itch, it is a challenging film, and one that deserves to be seen. Seems like it's not as well known as a lot of the popular New French Extremity ones, but definitely one that is worth your time. So if you haven't seen it, consider if it's one for you. It might not be, but if you check it out, definitely let me know what you think. So that's our doctorate level selection for the New French Extremity, but I've also got an extra credit selection because it's another movie that I thought deserved a little bit of shine, a little bit of a spotlight, so I wanted to bring it up and talk about it here. The extra credit selection is Trouble Every Day. Trouble Every Day came out in 2001 and is directed by Claire Denis, who is a very famous French indie filmmaker who's very well known. And interestingly, I knew her name. I'm familiar with her, but when I look up her work, her her filmography, turns out I haven't seen like anything else but this movie. And this movie is not necessarily indicative of the rest of her work, from what I understand. So it's interesting to see this being the movie that kind of brings me to Claire Denis, but I'm just not familiar with her other stuff. But maybe I should be checking that out. But that's also something we're going to dig into in just a second. First, if you haven't seen this movie, the movie is about an American couple that come to France, and the husband is looking for a scientist who he knows from the past, and the scientist's wife, who is suffering from some sort of condition that the scientist is trying to treat and also hide, that seems to make her sexually active or sexually aggressive and violent and homicidal, frankly. And he's trying to deal with that. Meanwhile, our American husband is trying to track the scientist down because he seems to have the same condition, the same potential urges, the same potential problem. And we're going to go ahead and stop there so as to not spoil the movie any further. But the movie is an interesting setup that is very different from your normal New French Extremity film. In fact, I would say it's safe to say that this movie is very light on New French Extremity in the way we think about it in terms of the gore and the violence and the extremeness of the extremity. It's really, honestly, in my opinion, kind of debatable if it's actually New French Extremity, but it does seem to pop up on all the lists. Again, when you look up New French Extremity, this movie tends to make the cut. And it's a little surprising when you watch it because it doesn't feel like other New French Extremity movies. Now, it may not be quite as gory as those other movies. Really, you don't get into the true gore until maybe the final act of the movie. There's some other hints to it earlier on, but it's definitely, again, like In My Skin, it's not painting the walls with blood. But it does have that transgressive vibe to it. It is talking about stuff that does feel taboo and feel dangerous. Violence that is particularly uncomfortable, scandalous, whatever you want to call it. So I guess in that sense, it's meeting the mark. And I'm not sure what the messaging is on this movie, more on that in a little bit. But it really does feel more like an art house horror film. It's a very slow, very, very slow movie. Languid. it is taking its time telling its story and letting the mystery unfold. And interestingly, it may be a French movie. It's made by a French director. It's set in France, but the majority of the dialogue is in English. Like it's largely in English because you have an American couple in there. The protagonist, or at least I guess you call him the protagonist, is played by Vincent Gallo, who is an American actor who is, in my opinion, usually kind of pretentious. I've liked some of his stuff, but he tends to kind of come off a little bit pretentious. Now, interestingly, he doesn't come off quite so much pretentious here as he comes off kind of flat, and I think that kind of works for the movie. Like, it really is this kind of dreamlike, ethereal film that everybody's kind of just floating through. And Gallo does feel like he's floating through this movie, which really underscores some of the actions as he kind of descends into his illness and whatever later on. It really kind of underscores that a little bit. But that's a long time coming. Like I said, this movie, it's not a long movie, but it feels long because it's very, very slow. And it really is, it doesn't seem like it's so concerned with narrative as it is with like a vibe, a feeling. Like Claire Denis does not seem too concerned about the story being underwritten, which it does feel like it is underwritten a little bit because she's kind of giving you this existential experience where you're just, experience is the right word, where you're just kind of experiencing this. It's kind of just happening and you're just kind of floating along with it. And that's not going to necessarily be for everybody. It's very impressionistic. Like there's some sex scenes in here and the camera work is so up close and the close-ups are so tight that you kind of can't even quite tell what's happening. And that also gets mirrored in some of the violent scenes as well. You're not 100% clear what it is you're seeing. So it's kind of like an impressionistic style. And I think that's the point. I think it's really about creating imagery and just kind of painting these pictures, these moving pictures. And the story is kind of secondary to it. And it does kind of work for that reason. Like it's a strange movie, but in a good way. And so again, when the violent things happen, it really kind of leaps out of you because you're almost lulled into this like trance, you're just kind of like in this daze watching this movie, and then these things will happen and it just snaps you out of it right away. You're like, oh crap, this is happening. And I like that. I like that Denis is really kind of trying to set up a mood or a vibe, but I'm not quite sure what her message is, to be honest with you. If I'm being honest with you, I don't know that I get it. I don't know if I get the movie. It does feel existential. It does feel like it's just kind of like almost stream of consciousness, but it feels like maybe there's supposed to be a deeper message. And I don't know. Like, I mean, some people call this like an erotic horror film. I don't think I'd go there with that one. I can understand like the way some of the things are shot, why that might be the case, but I wouldn't go there for that. But I do think there's something trying to be said other than just this story about sex cannibalism, for lack of a better way of putting it, because that's kind of really what it is talking. If you boil it all down, that's where it's going. And is that new French Extremity? Yeah, it's transgressive. Sure, it's extreme, it's gory. But overall, the movie doesn't have that vibe. The movie has more of a dreamlike quality. It feels maybe more like a more feminine David Lynch, if you will. Like it really feels kind of softer edges until it doesn't, until it doesn't have those, those guardrails and kind of just lets you have the horror. But even then, that stuff is still impressionistic and it's interesting. There's some horrific scenes in this movie, but overall, it might be kind of boring to people. That's kind of where I'm going with this. Some people might find this to be boring. I found it to be very captivating and intriguing, but I can see, but I admit it's slow. I can see people having an issue with it, struggling with it, getting bored, tapping out. I get it. There's no real character that you're rooting for, and there's nobody that you feel super invested in, and you don't necessarily know what the hell's going on for a large portion of it, and you're kind of waiting for something to happen. But if you can take a step back and just enjoy the visuals, enjoy the pace of it being just kind of like this lulling kind of like peaceful meditation, then I think maybe you can take it in a different way. It's weird to call a new French Extremity movie relaxing, but that's kind of what this is. So it's a very strange experience. And I honestly, I've seen this movie a couple times now, and I still don't know exactly how I feel about it. And so I'm curious if you've seen it to let me know what you feel about it, because it's a movie that I can see it's not, again, not gonna be for everybody, but not for the challenging gore reasons, although there is that, but maybe more for the pacing and storytelling issues. So let me know what you think. Again, not for everybody, but if you've checked it out, let me know your thoughts on it. And if you haven't seen it, I mean, you've heard what I've had to say, so it may or may not be for you. Maybe kind of do a little research before you check it out. There are the extreme violent stuff. It can be kind of trigger warning-y stuff, so look into it. But it's an interesting movie, and that's why I wanted to talk about it because it's just an interesting movie, and it's interesting for it to be in this subgenre. But that's why I brought it up. So that's my thoughts on that one, and that's my thoughts on the new French Extremity. Once again, going through this and highlighting the movies that I enjoy, at least, and a lot of us do. Again, the previous video was very popular, so hopefully you're enjoying these picks too, even though they're not quite as gory and bloody as the ones we talked about previously. There's still something to check out. There's still something that are worth your time. And now it's time to check out a Trivia Pursuit card. I'm going to try to answer this question live on camera, and of course, because we're talking about New French Extremity, we're going to look at the gore category of the card. And the question is this: who directed the 2007 Grindhouse fake trailer for Werewolf Women of the SS? I know this answer. I 100% know the answer to this. And I'm guessing a lot of you guys do too. And, to give you guys a slight clue, we have talked about this director multiple times on the channel. I would actually call myself probably kind of a fan of this. Like, there are some hardcore fans of this director, and I don't think I'd say I'd go that far, but I'd say I'd like more of his movies than I don't. And we've talked about several of them on the channel, so that gives you an idea. But he is a polarizing director. Let's put it that way. There's another clue for you: polarizing director. But for those of you that don't know, and I'm guessing that's very few of you, Grindhouse was a kind of a movie experience done in 2007. Apparently, I would have had a hard time guessing the year without the card. But it was actually two horror movies put together, one done by Robert Rodriguez, one done by Quentin Tarantino. Rodriguez's was Planet Terror, and Tarantino's was Death Proof. And they wanted to make it like an old 70s grindhouse movie with like missing reels and scratchy film and the whole bit, although it's all digital, so it doesn't quite look quite authentic. But they wanted to have it be a whole experience in the theater where you'd see it, and it would have coming attractions, and it would have previews in the middle between the two movies, and it had different previews done by different famous directors, and one of them was Werewolf Women of the SS. And that was the one that their card is asking about, and it was done by a famous horror director. So I'm kind of giving you a little bit of time to figure it out in case you don't already know off the top of your head. Like I said, a lot of you probably already knew this one. I knew this one for sure. So time for you to wrap up your thoughts on this one and make your guess, lock it in, because I'm about to answer. My answer is, of course, Rob Zombie, the controversial Rob Zombie, and Rob Zombie. The card says Rob Zombie. So yep, I got that one right. I knew I had that one right. Rob Zombie, along with Edgar Wright and Robert Rodriguez, did one of the trailers too. And I'm trying to remember who some of the other ones did, but that interesting. Werewolf Woman of the SS is the one movie that did not get made into another movie. No, I guess Edgar Wright's did it as well. But Machete, the one that Robert Rodriguez did get made into another movie. But yeah, Werewolf Woman of the SS, kind of making fun of the Nazi exploitation movies, which, by the way, we will be talking about on the Horror Movie Supplement. That's a video for another time, but we're going to dig into that controversial category or controversial subgenre, so stay tuned for that. But did you get Rob Zombie right? And if not, who did you guess? And let me know your thoughts on Rob Zombie. Do you love him? Do you hate him? Do you not care about him? Let me know in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. Let me know what you think about these new French Extremity movies, and if you've got any other ones that you think need some shine, leave them in the comments below. Probably already talked about them on the channel because we talked about a lot of them, but it doesn't matter. Bring them to the channel in the comments anyways, because I love reading your comments. I appreciate you guys. Thanks for sticking to the end of this video. I will see you next week, but until then, class dismissed.